The morning my son drove me to what I thought was a routine follow-up appointment, I had already baked a loaf of banana bread for the nurses who had taken care of me during my hip surgery. I wrapped it in foil, tied a little blue ribbon around it, and set it on my lap in the passenger seat like I was bringing a gift to a dinner party. That's the kind of woman I am. That's the kind of woman I have always been. And that morning, sitting in my son's car with that warm loaf on my lap, I genuinely believed the hardest part was behind me. I was wrong. The hardest part hadn't even started yet. My name is Margaret. Most people who love me call me Maggie. I'm 67 years old, and for 31 of those years I worked as a registered nurse at Mercy General Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. I held the hands of strangers on their worst days. I stayed late when no one asked me to. I drove home at midnight smelling like antiseptic and still managed to have a hot breakfast ready when my husband Tom and my 2 children came downstairs in the morning. I am not telling you this to make myself sound saintly. I'm telling you because you need to understand who I was before I tell you what my children did to me, and what I did about it. Tom passed away 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and merciless, the way that disease always is. We had 41 years together, and I would have gladly traded 20 of them for 10 more with him. After he was gone, I rattled around our house on Clover Ridge Road the way a single marble rattles around an empty tin can. Loud, purposeless, echoing. My son David lives 40 minutes away with his wife Patrice and their 2 boys. My daughter Sandra lives just across town, close enough that neither of them had an excuse, but far enough that they always seemed to find one. I broke my hip in February. A patch of ice on my back porch steps that I had told myself I would salt before the next freeze, and then I forgot, and then the next freeze came and I didn't forget so much as I simply stepped wrong, and the world went sideways. I heard the snap before I felt the pain. There is something uniquely humiliating about lying on your own frozen back porch, staring up at a gray Ohio sky, waiting for someone to find you. I was there for almost 2 hours before my neighbor Carol happened to look out her kitchen window and see my legs sticking out from the side of the house. The surgery went well. I knew it would. I had spent 3 decades watching people recover from exactly what I was going through, and I knew what to do and what not to do. The physical therapist told me I was her most cooperative patient. I took that as the highest possible compliment. David and Sandra took turns visiting at the hospital. They brought flowers, magazines, a cashmere blanket that Sandra picked out because she knows I run cold. Everything seemed fine. Everything seemed like family. On the morning David drove me to what he said was my 6-week post-op checkup, I noticed he had taken a different route than the one that leads to my orthopedic surgeon's office. I mentioned it. He said he knew a faster way. I let it go. I was watching the city slide past the window, thinking about whether the forsythia in my backyard had started blooming yet, thinking about getting home and sleeping in my own bed, thinking about absolutely nothing that I should have been thinking about. We pulled into the parking lot of a place called Whispering Pines Senior Living. The sign out front had a little waterfall logo next to the name, the kind of logo that is designed to make you think of peace and nature and gentle breezes instead of what the place actually is. I looked at David. I said, "This isn't Dr. Hensley's office." He turned off the engine. He didn't look at me right away. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel the way people do when they've rehearsed something and are trying to remember their lines. He said, "Mom, Sandra and I have been talking." He said, "We're worried about you living alone." He said, "This is just temporary. Just until you're fully back on your feet. Just a few weeks. Maybe 2 months at most." He said, "We already got you a room." He said, "It's a really nice room, Mom. It faces the garden." I sat with the foil-wrapped banana bread on my lap, and I listened to my son tell me that my life as I knew it had already been decided without me. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even anger. Not yet. It was something closer to vertigo, that feeling you get when the ground you were certain was solid turns out to be nothing but a painted picture of solid ground. I had raised this man. I had taught him to ride a bicycle in the driveway of that house on Clover Ridge Road. I had sat with him through the flu and heartbreak and the time he failed his bar exam and was convinced his life was over. And here he was, handing me a decision about my own life, as though it were a form I simply needed to sign. I asked him if he had spoken to my doctor about this. He said they had been in touch. I asked him if anyone had asked me. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mom, you can't manage the stairs right now." He said it like that settled everything. I went inside. What else was I going to do? I was 67 years old with a healing hip and no car and no phone numbers memorized except Tom's, which was a number that no one would ever answer again. I went inside and I met the woman at the front desk, and I shook her hand, and I let David carry my bag, the one he had apparently packed from my house when I wasn't watching, and I followed him down a carpeted hallway that smelled like lavender and industrial cleaner, and he showed me my room, which did indeed face the garden, and I stood at the window and looked at a row of bare February rose bushes, and I did not cry. I waited until he left. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and I thought carefully about everything. There was a knock at my door that evening. I said, "Come in," expecting a staff member, and instead a woman about my age walked in carrying 2 cups of tea on a small tray. She was tall, with silver hair cropped close, and the kind of posture you only see in women who spent their younger years dancing or doing something equally demanding of the spine. She said, "I'm Helen. I'm in the room next to yours. I heard a new neighbor moving in today, and I thought you might want company more than you want to be polite about not wanting company." I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in what felt like a very long time, even though it had only been a few hours. Her name was Helen Marsh, and she was 72 years old, and she had been at Whispering Pines for 8 months following a stroke that had left her with a slight tremor in her left hand and absolutely zero patience for nonsense. She was sharp and funny, and she had opinions about everything, about the food, about the evening news, about the correct way to make chicken soup, and she had been a high school English teacher for 35 years, and she read 3 books a week, and she reminded me a little of the version of myself I had always hoped I would eventually become. She listened to my story without interrupting, which is rarer than people realize. When I finished, she set down her teacup and said, "Well, do you have a lawyer?" I said yes, a man named Gerald Pierce who had handled my estate planning after Tom died. She said, "Good. Call him tomorrow morning. Find out exactly what is happening with your house and your finances. Then decide what you want to do." "I want to go home," I told her. She nodded. She said, "Yes, but you need to know what home looks like right now before you decide how to get back to it." She was right. She was exactly right. In the way that people who have already been through their own version of your crisis tend to be right. I called Gerald Pierce the next morning from the phone in my room. His assistant patched me through quickly. Gerald had known Tom and me for over 20 years, and I think my name on the caller ID was enough to move me to the front of the line. What Gerald told me over the next 10 minutes rearranged something fundamental in my understanding of my own life. David had contacted Gerald's office 3 weeks earlier. He had asked about the process for pursuing power of attorney for a parent with limited mobility. Gerald, to his credit, had explained that I would need to consent and that there were specific legal requirements, and David had apparently backed off that particular avenue. But Gerald had also learned, through a colleague who handled real estate closings across town, that a property on Clover Ridge Road had recently been listed with a realtor. My property? My house? The house Tom and I had bought in 1988 and painted 3 different colors before we agreed on the white with the green shutters. The house where my children had grown up. The house I had never, at any point, agreed to sell. I asked Gerald if I was in any immediate legal danger of losing control of my assets. He said no. He said not yet. He said, "Maggie, are you all right?" I said yes. I said, "I need you to do some things for me, Gerald. I have some decisions I'd like to make about my estate." I spent the next 2 weeks at Whispering Pines attending physical therapy twice a day and having dinner every evening with Helen Marsh and thinking very carefully about what I valued and what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. I am a deliberate person by nature. 31 years of nursing taught me that the decisions that matter most are the ones you make slowly, with all the information, with your emotions noted but not in charge. David visited once during those 2 weeks. He brought Patrice and the boys and a box of chocolates that the boys had clearly already gotten into. He asked how I was feeling. He said the room was nice, right? He said the garden would be beautiful once it warmed up. He did not mention the house listing. He did not mention the power of attorney inquiry. He was performing the role of attentive son with the same slightly forced cheerfulness he used to use when he'd gotten a bad grade and was trying to delay the conversation about it. I performed the role of comfortable mother who had come to terms with her new circumstances. I have been a nurse for 31 years. I know how to hold my face steady while my thoughts move very fast. Sandra came the following Saturday. She brought flowers, tulips, yellow, my favorite, and she talked for 45 minutes about her job and her husband Kevin and the remodeling they were doing on their kitchen. She mentioned, very briefly and very casually, that she thought it might be good for me to stay at Whispering Pines through the spring. For the structure, she said. For the social aspect. I looked at my daughter across the small table where Helen and I took our tea, and I thought about the 18 hours I spent in labor before she arrived in this world. I thought about how she used to climb into bed between Tom and me during thunderstorms until she was 9 years old. I thought about how I had driven 4 hours round trip every month for 2 years to watch her college volleyball games because she had asked me to come, and I never once considered not coming. I said, "Sandra, has the house been listed with a realtor?" The tulips on the table were very yellow. The silence in the room was very complete. She said, "Mom, it's not what you think," she said. "We were just exploring options." She said, "The upkeep on that house is a lot, and you've been saying for years that it's too big." She said, "David and I thought." I said, "Did it ever occur to you and David to ask what I thought?" She looked at her hands. She looked exactly like her brother had looked in that parking lot. I wondered if they had practiced this too, separately, each of them managing their own version of the same conversation with the same avoidance strategy. I said, "Sandra, I am not angry with you." I said it and I meant it, because by that point I had moved through the anger and arrived somewhere quieter and more certain. I said, "But I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am 67 years old, not 97. I had hip surgery, not a personality transplant. I am still the person who makes decisions about my own life. I want to make sure you understand that clearly." She started crying. I handed her a tissue from the box on my nightstand, the same way I had handed tissues to patients and families for 3 decades, with the same steady hands and the same refusal to be destabilized by someone else's tears, however genuine. I want you to know that what happened next was not revenge. I have thought about this carefully because I think the distinction matters. Revenge is about making someone else hurt the way they hurt you. What I did was not about hurting my children. It was about making my life legible to them in a language they seemed to understand, which, as it turned out, was the language of consequences. Gerald Pierce and I had several long conversations. I instructed him to contact the realtor handling the Clover Ridge listing and inform them that the property owner had not authorized any listing and that any sale attempt would be met with immediate legal action. The listing was quietly removed within 48 hours. I also worked with Gerald to revise my estate documents significantly. Tom and I had accumulated a comfortable life: the house, a retirement account, some investments, the proceeds from Tom's life insurance. It was not a vast fortune, but it was enough to matter, which is to say it was enough that my children had apparently decided it was worth making decisions around without consulting me. I designated a substantial portion of my estate to a fund I established through our local hospital system, a fund specifically for training programs for nursing assistants, the people who do the daily, unglamorous, essential work of caring for patients that the healthcare system chronically undervalues and underpays. I had been one of those people at the beginning of my career. I knew what that work costs you and what it deserves. I left David and Sandra each a specific and modest amount, enough to communicate that I had thought about them, not enough to be the foundation of any plans they might have been building. I left the house to myself, with instructions that it would pass to a local land trust upon my death unless I changed my mind, which I reserved every right to do. Then I called David and Sandra, and I asked them to come to Whispering Pines together. I asked Gerald to be present. I asked Helen if she would sit in the room because she had been part of the thinking that brought me to this point, and because I wanted at least one person in the room who was unambiguously on my side. They arrived together. They sat across from Gerald and me at the small round table in the common room I had reserved for the afternoon. Sandra was holding her purse in her lap too tightly. David was wearing his courtroom face, the one that tries to look calm and reads instead as slightly frozen. Gerald walked them through the revised estate documents in the careful, precise way that lawyers communicate unpleasant information clearly, without drama, with all the relevant specifics. I watched my children's faces as they understood what they were hearing. When Gerald finished, I spoke. I said, I want to be clear about something. I said, I am not doing this because I don't love you. I love you both in a way that has no floor and no ceiling, and I always will. I said, I am doing this because somewhere between raising you and getting older, I became invisible to you. I became a situation to manage, rather than a person to consult. I said, I don't know exactly when that happened, but I know I let it happen for too long by not saying anything, and that was my failure, and I own it. I said, I moved back here because I am your mother, and I wanted to believe the best of you, and I still do. But my name is on my life, not yours, mine. And I need you both to genuinely understand that. David said, Mom, we never meant. I said, I know. I actually believe that. I think you both made these decisions because you thought they were practical, and you convinced yourselves that practical was the same as right. I said, it isn't. Not when you're making practical decisions about someone else's life without asking them. Sandra said, Are you? Is this final? The will? I said, Gerald can explain that estate documents are always subject to revision by the person who wrote them. I said, But what revises them is time, and trust, and demonstrated respect. I said, That's up to you. The room was quiet for a while. Helen sat with her good hand folded over her left one, the one with the tremor, and she looked out the window at the garden where the February rose bushes were still bare and waiting. David looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was about 22 years old and going through something genuinely difficult. He looked young suddenly. He said, Mom, I'm sorry. He said it slowly, like each word was arriving from somewhere real, rather than being retrieved from a rehearsed list. He said, I think we got scared when you fell, and we handled it badly, and we told ourselves we were helping when we were actually just trying to feel less scared ourselves. It was the most honest thing he had said to me in a long time. Sandra reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She said, I miss you in that house. She said, I drove past it last week and I thought about how it smells inside you. Know how it always smells like whatever you've been baking, and also a little bit like that cedar chest in the upstairs hallway? She said, I don't want it sold either, Mom. I think David and I got confused about what we were actually trying to do. I put my other hand over Sandra's and I held on to it the way I used to hold on to her when she was small and we were crossing a parking lot. I said, Then let's not be confused anymore. I came home to Clover Ridge Road on a Tuesday in late March. The forsythia had bloomed. Helen Marsh had given me her phone number written in the elegant cursive of a woman who spent 35 years teaching other people to write clearly, and she had also given me a book she said changed the way she thought about the second half of her life, and she had stood in the doorway of her room at Whispering Pines and watched me walk down that lavender-scented hallway with only a slight hitch in my step, and she had said, Go on, Maggie. Go on, home. I salted the back porch steps before I even took off my coat. In the months that followed, things did not go back to the way they had been, because the way they had been was part of the problem. What we built instead was something new and more deliberate. David started calling on Sunday evenings. Not long, elaborate calls, just 20 minutes or so, just checking in, just asking questions, and waiting to hear the answers. Sandra started coming over for dinner twice a month on nights when Kevin was traveling, and she brought wine, and we sat at my kitchen table the way we used to when she was in high school and would tell me things she didn't tell anyone else. It was not perfect. Families are not a problem you solve once. They are something you tend the same way you tend a garden, with regular attention and honest assessment of what is thriving and what is not, and what needs to be cut back so something better can grow. I started volunteering at Mercy General 2 mornings a week, not in a clinical capacity, but sitting with patients in the waiting rooms, particularly the older ones who had come alone. I knew what it felt like to need someone to just be present, to not require anything from you, to let you take up space without apologizing for it. It turned out I was useful. It turned out I had always been useful, and had simply needed to stop letting other people define what that meant. The Nursing Assistant Training Fund began accepting its first applicants the following autumn. Gerald sent me the paperwork and I signed it at my kitchen table with Tom's old fountain pen, the one I keep in the center drawer where I have always kept it. I thought about Tom while I signed it. I thought about how much he would have laughed at this whole story. Not unkindly, but with that particular laugh he had, that meant he was proud of me, and didn't quite know how to say it directly. I am not a woman who was defeated. I want to be clear about that. I am a woman who was momentarily unseated from her own life by people who loved her clumsily and who made decisions out of fear and called it concern. I am also a woman who has held enough hands at enough bedsides to know that what happens in the final chapters of a life is not fixed. It is written day by day, decision by decision, by the person who is actually living it. That person is me. My name is Margaret. My friends call me Maggie. I am 67 years old and I live in a white house with green shutters on Clover Ridge Road, and the forsythia blooms every spring right on schedule, and I have banana bread in the oven right now, and I have not once since that March 2 afternoon forgotten to salt the back porch steps. My life is mine, and I intend to live every last day of it.